interrupt this broadcast from Long Beach, California to bring you this breaking news story. I'm Dick Veneer of the Facade News Network, the 24/7 network that goes straight to the surface of a story and stays there. Award-winning, in-shallow reporting. We're not worried about the facts or reality. We invent the news. Ladies and gentlemen, this disturbing report just coming into our newsroom here from an obscure radio station in Southern California, KPFK, is reporting that the Goddess Almighty herself has held a rare press conference. Unprecedented. It's been several years since we've heard from the goddess in heaven. Speaking at the Eden Hotel in room 666, the Goddess Almighty says she has never been in contact with President George W. Bush. Bush, as you know, has repeatedly said that God told him to invade Iraq. The Goddess Almighty has made her telephone logs and emails available to the international and intergalactic press, and there is no contact between the Goddess Almighty and the White House. The goddess said, "You know, dude, I don't even know the guy. Maybe he has me confused with Dick Cheney." Stay tuned to this radio network for updates on this breaking news story. I'm Dick Veneer of Facade News. Back now to our regularly scheduled program in Long Beach, California. Well, good evening. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to be in this space. I've heard so much about it. And I'd like to thank Global Voices and Viente Agua and Aware in Long Beach. Aware Long Beach. You don't want to be unaware in Long Beach. It would be very uncomfortable. So stay with being aware. And I love the fact that we're meeting here in a place where art is so prominent, because I have a background in music myself. I used to study sitar in India and had pretensions to be a musician at one point. And I'm still very interested in the arts, and the way I got into radio, actually, was as a music DJ. I did a world music program on KGNU, the community radio station in Boulder, called Ganges to the Nile, an international music program, which I quickly politicized and started bringing in voices from the countries that I was playing music from. And then would have the poetry of Hafiz and Rumi and Attar from Iran, and then from India and Pakistan, Ghalib and Mir and Momin and other great poets, Muhammad Iqbal, and try to present global culture, because it was at a time of extreme distortion of Islam and Muslim civilization, very much as we are now experiencing once again. A massive amount of propaganda and reductionist formulae about, Muslims are like this, all Arabs are like that, all Iranians are like this, all Turks, are like that. It is simply very unnuanced, and you can see in the collapse of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. I mean, you can hardly call it a policy. It's certainly foreign, but in terms of being informed by rational thinking and any kind of intellectual rigor or awareness, that word again, it's simply appalling. And it's up to us as still free citizens in a democratic society. We're not in change yet. A lot of us, have imprisoned ourselves in many ways. We have to decolonize our own minds, as Tiongi of Kenya wrote about, decolonizing the mind. Stephen Biko, who was arrested and then killed by the South African secret police in the 1970s. He was one of the early heroes of the African National Congress. He said the greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So it is incumbent upon us to break those chains ourselves. Just because, we think we're cool, we're left, we're hip, we drink, cappuccinos and lattes and eat tofu and tempeh and organic arugula, it's not enough. I see you all indulge in those things. And listen to KPFK at 90.7. It's not enough. There's a lot of work we have to do in terms of breaking down patriarchy, breaking down misogyny, racism, classism, ageism, all of these things that need to be overcome if we are to advance an agenda of social justice and peace. And I love being around art because I'm always reminded about the intersection of art and politics, how art has contributed tremendously to awakening conscience and informing people of important things. For example, Picasso's Guernica, a painting that brought, in a very graphic way, the horror of a blitzkrieg on a Spanish town in 1937 that was bombed by the German Air Force in support of Francisco Franco, the Falangist leader who was going to take over Spain from 1939. And you think of Woody Guthrie and the Weavers, Bob Dylan, to come into a more modern time, the work of Arthur Miller, a playwright, in terms of pointing out issues of social justice, class inequality. Death of a Salesman is a magnificent work of art. And that's how artists help us to imagine a different world. Another world is possible, but it's often through art, through music, through poetry, through dance, through theater, that we get outside of ourselves. We get beyond, the cabal running the White House that lied to us, So like we're all victims, They lied to us. We are passive victims, as if we have no agency, as if we have no autonomy or responsibility for being lied to or not being able to deconstruct the lies. So there's a very interesting dynamic that goes on there. Dylan is enjoying, again, very much deserved, a kind of heightened popularity because of the Martin Scorsese 4-hour PBS documentary, No Direction Home. And I think, Dylan has always been fearless and has, told it like it is, from the times they are changing to Masters of War, right down to the present, right down to Hurricane, when he was talking about the imprisonment of an innocent African-American in New Jersey, a boxer, Hurricane Carter. And I'm reminded of the courage of artists, people like Eartha Kitt, who many of you may not be familiar with, an African-American singer and Broadway performer who was invited to the White House in 1968 by Lyndon Johnson and denounced the war on Vietnam in front of Johnson, in front of the cabinet. This took a lot of courage, and it really set an example for resistance. There's a case just in the last few weeks of Sharon Olds, O-L-D-S. She's a professor at New York University, and she won a very prestigious award, the National Book Circle Award, and she was invited to Washington, D.C. by Laura Bush, to participate in some very prestigious events with an enormous amount of media coverage. And this is what she wrote to Laura Bush. She said, "I found your invitation very appealing, obviously. Poets don't have an opportunity to speak before hundreds, even thousands. Usually it's a small group or intimate, gathering of friends. So this would have been a tremendous kind of career breakthrough for her to reach a national and perhaps an international audience. So she said, I found your invitation appealing, but I could not face the idea of breaking bread with you. I knew that if I sat down to eat with you, it would feel to me as if I were condoning what I see to be the wild, high-handed actions of the Bush administration. So many Americans who had felt pride in our country now feel anguish and shame for the current regime of blood, wounds, and fire. I thought of the clean linens at your table, the shining knives, and the flames of the candles, and quite frankly, I could not stomach it." Sharon Olds. And you have, artists like Gil Scott-Heron, who is kind of the progenitor of a lot of the the hip-hop and the rap that you hear today. People like Michael Franti, Boots Riley, Dr. Dre, DJ Spooky, a whole range of people, Tupac Shakur, really kind of derive their artistic and intellectual lineage from Gil Scott-Heron, who did, in some incredible poems, standing up with, small music ensemble in the back, Whitey on the Moon, It's Winter in America. And one of his great pieces, which I'm going to present to you right now in an edited form, slightly updated for some current realities. So if you could just imagine, close your eyes for a moment. We have a music ensemble behind me. There you see Miles Davis on trumpet, John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Wynton Kelly on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, and Ron Carter on bass. Night in Tunisia. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 2 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of George W. Bush blowing a bugle, leading a charge up a hill, followed by Condi Rice and Spiro Agnew and General Abrams and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Exxon Mobil and will not star Matt Damon or Ben Affleck or George Clooney. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of your acne. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner or give you lips like Julia Roberts or hips like Britney Spears or give you perfect skin. No, the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white people, white chocolate, or white lightning. You'll not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, a tiger in your tank, or a giant in your toilet bowl. Things won't go better with iPods, iMacs, or iTunes. The revolution won't be televised. The revolution will not go better with Coke, Pepsi, Sprite, Diet 7-Up, or 2% soy latte. The revolution will not fight the germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, not be televised, not be televised. There'll be no reruns, brothers and sisters. The revolution will be live on alternative radio on KPFK Los Angeles. Woo! And you can hear alternative radio on KPFK every Friday in its new time slot at 2 o'clock. And that's the program I produce out of Boulder, Colorado. I started it in my home in 1978. It was totally, exploit yourself type of operation with no overhead. I was eating all the overhead. And then finally, in 1995, I was able to graduate. I was able to rent space and start to hire a staff. And so now I'm able to travel around the country, around the world, because I have people minding the store in Boulder. I mean, I used to pick up the phone. I used to answer everything and make the dubs, take the dubs to the post office, mail them, come back, answer the phones, open the letters, and do everything. I tell you that because this kind of work is not that difficult. It's clerical mostly, particularly media analysis. It's basically looking at the guest list, who appears on these programs like the Snooze Hour with Jim Lehrer. How many more government officials is he going to, interview before he completely falls asleep? I mean, I've heard rumors that actually Lehrer died a few years ago, and he's being kept alive artificially. There's actually, if you notice, every once in a while his jaw drops, and then he gets this jolt. Well, that's because the producer in the back room has an electric cable attached to Lehrer and gives him a little 5-watt jolt, and it wakes him up, and then he kind of, asks the question, well, General, yes, Senator, yes, Mr. Vice President. Lehrer, of course, sets a new low, or a new nadir, not Ralph, in obsequiousness, in servility, and this is something, and I'm picking Lehrer because that's PBS. I mean, that's the left wing. That's Marxist-Leninism. That's extreme, radical journalism in the United States. So that's why I want to start right there. I don't want to go to the more, center or right media. And Lehrer has, never met a government official, present or retired, that he hasn't fallen in love with. I mean, it's amazing that he has now been on PBS since 1975, 30 years. The longest-running program in PBS history, incidentally, was another left-wing communist, probably Trotskyite program, and that was Firing Line with William F. Buckley. 33 years on PBS. So when the right wing is attacking NPR and PBS, you wonder how much of the Kool-Aid they're drinking. Probably by the gallon. They're not sipping that stuff, man. They are just guzzling it. Because if you look at the evidence of Morning Edition and All Things Considered and Terry Gross's Fresh Air and Car Talk and all the other programs, there's not a lot of radical voices on there. You don't hear the people that you hear on alternative radio, for example. You don't hear Arundhati Roy or Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky. Or if you do, it's once in 20 years. The last time Chomsky was on the NewsHour, or the Snooze Hour with Jim Lehrer, was in September 1990. And he hasn't been on since. Okay, so in the 30 years of that program, the foremost intellectual dissident critic in the United States, and who is in enormous demand outside our country, has only been on this program once. He is rarely on Morning Edition or All Things Considered. Michael Parenti, forget it. Forget about it, like they say on The Sopranos. Angela Davis, forget about it. Tariq Ali, forget about it. Vandana Shiva, forget about it. Any of the radical voices, progressive voices of women from the third world, you simply do not hear from on the corporate media, including PBS and NPR. And if ever they do appear, it's tokenism. They have to always find a contrary voice to act as a balance, because they don't want, although when a right-wing mainstream voice is on, when Vice President Cheney is on, or Donald Rumsfeld, there is no other voice there, to challenge some of the mendacities that are spewing forth from Rumsfeld and from Cheney. So the revolution will not be televised, that's for sure. It may be broadcast and possibly on the internet, which has seen a huge explosion of information, radical and progressive, and that is making another world possible. That is the theme of the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil, that another world is possible. We can imagine a different society, a different set of economic relations, of social relations, of gender relations. It's important to, have a critique, and that's why I started my program, Alternative Radio, in Boulder in 1978. I was just bored with the corporate media. There's nothing there. It's boring. It's lies. So I said, okay, I'll do something about it. And I began with no resources, no background. I barely graduated from high school. I don't have any credentials, thank God, because I feel I was able to do this work quickly because I hadn't gone through the indoctrination filters. I didn't have to unlearn the propaganda because I was never propagandized. A lot of our students, a lot of the people who go through the professions are heavily brainwashed. And so I feel grateful that, I was such a lousy student and played hooky all the time and lied to my mother about how well I was doing in school until she got, a report card with all D's on them. And I had to go to summer school in order to graduate. Another world is possible. We see that in India, one of the poorest countries in the world, specifically in an area called the Narmada Valley in Madhya Pradesh. This is where the Narmada River has its course. And there were huge World Bank, IMF dam projects that were being funded that were going to flood out the indigenous populations in those areas. Poor people. They didn't have cell phones. They don't have cell phones. They don't have internet access. They don't have DSLs. They don't even have phones. They don't even have P.O. boxes. They don't have any of the kind of accoutrements that, our electronically rich culture just takes for granted. But somehow, and they were mostly women, people like Mehda Patkar and others, organized themselves and resisted the seemingly overwhelming power of the World Bank and the IMF and the Indian government, which was heavily pushing these big dam projects. And they were successful in many instances. Arundhati Roy has written about this in one of her books, War Talk. I think it's very important that we pay attention to these kinds of organizations and grassroots movements, particularly in the third world, people who have none of the advantages that we have. In fact, it's something that comes up, a lot in American audiences. In fact, I was asked about it today, and I asked Chomsky about it in my new book here called Imperial Ambitions. At every single meeting I attend in the United States, I am asked the question, what should I do? You're my leader, I will follow you. You're the oracle from Delphi. Whatever you say is the Dharma. I will obey. Well, first of all, I reject that, any kind of podium or iconization. We're all individuals. We're autonomous. We have sovereignty. I don't think you should follow anyone. You should follow your own voice, your own conscience, not because, Joe told you do this or Eloise told you do that. Do it because you feel it's a right thing to do. It's authentic. It's something you feel genuine about. That's so important in whatever you do, feeling authenticity. So Chomsky has asked this question, right? What should I do? I'm never asked this question in the third world. When I go to Turkey or Colombia or Brazil, they don't ask me what should I do. They tell me what they're doing. When I went to Porto Alegre for the World Social Forum, I met with some landless campesinos. They didn't ask me what they should do. They told me what they were doing. These are poor, oppressed people living under horrendous conditions, and they would never dream of asking me what they should do. It's only in highly privileged cultures like ours that people ask this question. We have every option open to us and have none of the problems that are faced by, say, intellectuals in Turkey, or women's rights advocates in Pakistan, or human rights advocates in Bangladesh, or campesinos in Brazil. We can do a lot of things, but people here are trained to believe that there are easy answers. It doesn't work that way. If you want to do something, you have to be dedicated and committed to it day after day. Educational programs, organizing, activism, that's the way things change. You want a magic key so you can go back to watching television tomorrow? It doesn't exist. And that's why I tell people that we should think about activism in terms of a marathon, not a sprint. To win a marathon, you have to really train yourself. You have to, practice over a long period of time. You have to build up your stamina. And a sprint is a very different type of race. So think in terms of the long race and a long run, very much the tortoise and the hare type of thing. Ultimately, the tortoise wins the race because the tortoise has stamina. It has built up its strength, and the hare runs out of energy and steam. And I asked also Tariq Ali in this book, speaking of empire and resistance. Tariq was born in Lahore, which was then British India, in 1943. Brilliant intellectual, activist, scholar, novelist, filmmaker, as they say in India and Pakistan, an all-arounder. He can do many, many things. And this is my new book with him. He's very much in the tradition of Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed, who is his mentor, another Pakistani intellectual activist, Iqbal Ahmed. What do you say, I asked him, because these are the questions people ask me, so I have this lucky job. I get to then ask these guys and women, like Arundhati Roy and Vandana Shiva and others, what do you tell people after they've demonstrated, against the war in Iraq and, had women in black and had candlelight vigils and wrote letters and made phone calls and sent emails to their senators and congressmen? What do you tell them after the war has started? They think the game's over, they give up, and they go home. Well, Tariq says, the game isn't over. I think for many people, it might have been their first time that they were really engaged in this kind of activism. And they thought once Iraq was invaded, the game was up. But as we have seen, there is now an Iraqi resistance which grows every day. The U.S. generals know they are trapped, and they are searching for a way out. In this situation, it's important to keep the pressure on. Not to stay home, not to, go blank in front of a TV screen or a computer screen, but to be active, to be engaged. And that's why meetings like this are so important, even though, there's only like 30 people here, David must feel bummed out. Well, I don't feel bummed out. I get a $100,000 speaking fee from Viento y Agua and from Boulder. So, I'm a mercenary. I do it for money. I'm honest. So I don't feel bummed out. But actually, it's very encouraging. And I love addressing small audiences because of the intimacy of it. I can see your eyes. It's not like, sometimes I'm on a stage with lights in my face and there's some blackness out there. And I know there are people out there because you hear coughing and sneezing and laughing. But there's no eye contact. And so, I value these kinds of meetings. And I'm reminded of a great couplet that Jalaluddin Rumi, the Sufi master from Iran, once said, "It is in meetings like this that when the seekers of truth come together, that the secrets are unveiled, that the mysteries reveal themselves." So in this kind of atmosphere, it's important for you to see that there are other people here. You're not alone. You're not nuts. You're not crazy for thinking the Bush administration is, off the wall and has engaged in a series of lies and launched an imperialist war of aggression, which should find all of them, every single one of them, from Alberto Gonzalez to Condi Rice to Powell to Wolfowitz to Stephen Hadley to Rumsfeld to Cheney to Bush, all of them should be sitting next to Milosevic in The Hague facing an international war crimes tribunal. Milosevic, compared to these guys and gals, is like an altar boy. I mean, it's a terrible thing he did. 5, 6, 7,000 people killed in the Balkans. But compared to the carnage, ongoing carnage that is being wreaked in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, don't forget, now in its 4th year of occupation, it's simply immeasurable. And where are the voices? Where is the Democratic Party? Where's the media? Talking about the Nuremberg Tribunal? Where is the media talking about the Geneva Conventions or the UN Charter? Let's talk about the liberal media, like the New York Times, way out there. Again, left, liberal, Marxist, Leninist, maybe a Trotskyite faction. They had 70 editorials on Iraq before the war. This is documented. You can find this information. Again, you just Google it. You don't have to be a Harvard PhD to figure this stuff out. It's all at your fingertips. The New York Times had 70 editorials on Iraq from September 11th, 2001 until the invasion on March 20th, 2003. In not one of those editorials, had you read them, would you have even known of the Nuremberg tribunals and the UN Charter. The UN Charter, which specifically says the planning and waging of aggressive war is the supreme international war crime. The supreme international war crime. Attacking a country that is not threatening you. When you launch a premeditated, unprovoked attack on another country, that is why German generals were hung at Nuremberg and why Japanese officials and military people were hung in Tokyo, because they attacked other countries. They attacked Indonesia. They attacked the Philippines. They attacked Singapore. They attacked Malaya. The Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Greece, Holland, Belgium, France, and a host of other countries. That's why they were held in such opprobrium for planning and waging aggressive war. You know, Goebbels and the other high-ranking Nazis who were there, they're saying, this is victor's justice. We're here because we lost. That's how it always is in history. But the American counsel appointed by FDR, his name was Robert Jackson, a Supreme Court justice, he said, pointing to them in the dock, you are not here because you lost the war. You are here because you started the war. And so that precedent, that legal precedent of Nuremberg was taken literally verbatim and put in the UN Charter. The UN Charter has been approved by the United States Senate. That makes it the law of the land under the Constitution. All treaties that the United States government approves becomes the supreme law of the land. In addition, in 1996, the United States passed the War Powers Act. This was at the height of the Balkan issue. This act, which can lead to a maximum penalty of death, says very explicitly that anyone involved in the violation of the Geneva Conventions, that is, to protect prisoners, not to allow the transfer of population, not to allow colonization of captured land. Anyone who contributes to that is in violation of the War Powers Act, punishable by death. That is not mentioned at all. The New York Times never mentioned the Nuremberg Tribunal, as I said, and the UN Charter. Thus, very few Americans actually realized that their country was engaging in a major international war crime. Also, they had no imprimatur from the Security Council of the United States, of the United Nations, excuse me. And so this is a very important issue. You know, the rule of law. Are we going to be ruled by the rules of the jungle, which apparently is very comfortable for some members of the Bush administration, since they feel that they have all the guns, they control the three branches of government. You know, we'll do what we want. You know, it's like what Daddy Bush said in the late 80s, early 90s. He said, quote, "What we say goes," telling the rest of the world, you know, just watch it. You know, we've got the guns, we can use them. And of course, the neocons that have seized power since 2000, they are dedicated to imperial violence. They are mistakenly called conservatives. They have nothing to do with conservative economics or conservative ideology. They are radical nationalists. They are hyper-jingoists. They are racist. And they are intent on using military power to maximize gain. They say it clearly in their documents. If you read them, the Project for the New American Century, again, you can Google it on your computer. It says explicitly that the United States ace, its trump, is military force, and we should use it. We don't have the economic leverage that we once had. Do you know that after World War II, 50% of the world's wealth was generated by the United States? I mean, half the world's economy was, you know, from the United States. That's how rich the country was then, completely unthreatened, in command of all the oceans, all the borders, and in an unprecedented position of power, very much like way beyond anything imagined by Rome or Greece or Britain or any of the halcyon empires of old. Now, to go back to, you know, so the corporate media, the liberal media, have a lot to answer for. They have not performed. They are lapdogs with laptops. They have collapsed. They have nothing to do with journalism. You know, instead of monitoring the centers of power, they have joined the centers of power. And they brag about it. They're happy about it. They love to tell stories about playing golf with the Secretary of State, or playing tennis with the Defense Secretary, or being invited to the White House for a dinner with George Bush and Laura Bush, or meeting Vice President Dick Cheney and his lovely wife, Lynn, you know, in the Vice President's office, et cetera, et cetera. There is no distance now between the Fourth Estate and the rest of the federal government. And that's a real problem for democracy. And it does not serve the communication needs of a democratic society. If we are to have a democratic society, as Jefferson said, we need information. Information is central to the communication needs of a democratic society. And if the people are in the dark, if the people are in a collective chadur, you know, a kind of a black veil, they don't know what's going on. And of course then, some demagogue can get on television, I'll leave you to imagine who that might be, and tell you that Iraq is about to attack you, and we must attack Iraq in order to protect you. And you don't know. And then they say it's for democracy and liberation and freedom. And you don't know. You don't know history. You don't know the history of U.S. overthrowing democratically elected governments, most recently Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, most recently trying to overthrow a democratically elected government in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, in a coup d'etat in April 2002, and on and on. The number of instances of the United States actively working against democratic forces. Lumumba in the Congo, Allende in Chile, Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. This year is the 40th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic. Does anyone even know about it? It's just disappeared from history. Those aren't the good stories. It's down Orwell's memory hole. A leftist radical, fairly radical, independent-minded nationalist leader, Juan Bosch, is democratically elected in the Dominican Republic. Within months, Johnson, the great liberal, is sending the Marines to liberate Santo Domingo from the oppressive rule of a democratic government. This history is known outside the United States. It's particularly known in Latin America, where the U.S. has intervened perhaps more than all the other continents combined. I mean, that would be an interesting little study to do. The number of times the U.S. has intervened in Cuba, which is going on to this very moment. If you do not think an economic and trade embargo is a form of intervention, I've got news for you. Just travel to Cuba and see the consequences of an economic and a trade embargo and a blockade. Just last week, I think it was maybe on page 26 of the New York Times. If you look carefully, there was a 2-paragraph article. It wasn't even an article. I think it was an AP report about the latest General Assembly vote on Cuba, on the sanctions and the blockade, the trade embargo. The vote was, as it has been in previous years, 182 to 4. So let's go down the 4. Of course, the United States supports its own policy, followed by, some real heavy hitters, some of the major international players, the Marshall Islands, Palau, that's not Persian rice, and Israel. So, in effect, basic colonies under the thumb of the United States. 182 to 4 to reject the policy of the Cuban policy of embargo and isolation. Where's the international law on this? Where's the enforcement? Of course, the General Assembly has no enforcement power. It's all with the Security Council. And there the United States exercises its veto more than any country in the history of the United Nations. 40 vetoes alone to protect Israel. Vetoes protecting the United States itself when the Security Council actually got some gumption up in 1989 to condemn the criminal attack on Panama. You remember Panama? Do you go back? Anyone here born in the 80s? It was, a few years ago. Noriega was about to take over the United States. You remember Manuel Noriega? Another Hitler, just like Gaddafi and the Medellin and Cali cartels. They were, we were in great danger. I mean, you have to be proud of your country and your military for, taking out powerhouses like Panama. And let's not forget Grenada. I mean, I was quaking in my boots. Do you remember in 1983, Reagan told us Grenada was a great threat to the national security of the United States? Man, I was so glad that the Marines were immediately dispatched to protect us so that we could continue to shop at Walmart and Kmart and Penny's and May D&F and Nordstrom's and all the other stores, max out our credit cards, really enjoy the flourishing meaning of what it means to be an American in the 20th and 21st century. Consume, consume, consume. Fill up the cart, max out the credit card, shop till you drop. That's their vision, actually, of you. That's their vision of what citizens should be. And you should turn out every 4 years to vote for one of the other business candidates, maybe in the dark. It doesn't really matter, they both went to Yale. They're both members of Skull and Bones. They're both millionaires. Okay, might be some slight differences. So that's your choice. And then go back home and then start drinking Coors again, which is not even beer. It's made in Colorado. It's Colorado water that's served cold. I know, the brewery's not far from where I live. It's in Golden, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado. So in Latin America, you have history of interventions, oppression, embargoes. The U.S. invaded Cuba on a false pretext in 1898. I haven't seen a single explanation anywhere, even in the left media, what there is of it, of how Guantanamo happens to be a U.S. base. I mean, I do have a very plausible explanation for it. It's kind of, Cuba, Buena Vista Social Club, and Maraqueñas, the happy-go-lucky Latins, they dance a lot and have a good time. And they looked north to the United States, El Norte, and they saw this, very tiny little country that didn't have enough land. People were overcrowded, living on top of one another. So they said to Cubans, people, because they're very generous, right? The Latinos are just always so forthcoming. Let's give Guantanamo to the Americans, as a gesture of solidarity. Maybe help them with their Lebensraum, with their living space problem. I mean, this land was seized in a war, in another criminal war, in another century, in another series of lies. At another time when an American president, this time McKinley, went down on his knees and prayed to God for guidance on what he should do. And God told him to invade the Philippines, to invade Puerto Rico, to invade Cuba and the Marshall Islands and Guam and all the other islands in the South Pacific and Western Pacific. So you see, what goes around comes around. American presidents have always invoked God. It's their big ace in the hole. It's like, don't get close to me. I'm surrounded by purity and protected by, the goddess Almighty herself. I am acting in the name of God. In case you didn't notice, Bush, around that initial skit I did, Bush has said on several occasions that God told him to invade countries. So we're supposed to back off and not say a word. But the people of Latin America know history, and they know the history of interventions and invasions and oppression. And you see today, Latin America is perhaps the most exciting place on the planet in terms of resistance, in terms of popular mobilizations, in terms of grassroots organizations that are working on the ground, like Movimiento Sin Tierra in Brazil, like Via Campesina in Argentina, like the movements in Bolivia and Ecuador and in Chile and many other countries that are resisting neoliberalism, that are rolling back the tide of privatization and elimination of the social safety net. They've had enough. They said basta. And you saw that in Mar del Plata just 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago when they came out in their thousands. And Bush was humiliated once again. And Hugo Chavez, gave an incredible speech before thousands of people in Mar del Plata. In Bolivia, of course, there's a very strong indigenous movement in that Andean country. A few years ago, Bechtel, one of the big American multinationals, went into Cochabamba and privatized the water. Now, water is not, it's not ballpoint pens. Water is like the staff of life. And now you're playing with people's lives. When you're talking about water and grain and air. This is it. This is how we subsist, basically. And so the price of water, with the collusion of a corrupt Bolivian government, that probably, I don't know for sure, but Bechtel may certainly, cut some deals to get in there, privatizes the water. Overnight, this poor population's water quadruples, quintuples. And they can't pay for it. Well, you can't pay for it. You're a mom, you're a dad, you're a husband, you're a wife, you're a nephew, you're a niece, or whatever. You're out in the streets protesting. And there was a huge intifada. There was a huge uprising of people. And they were able to roll back the privatization. The Bolivian government had no alternative but to break its agreement with Bechtel, which was a very corrupt agreement that they had engaged in. And there are examples like that all across Latin America today. And Evo Morales, who is the indigenous leader in Bolivia, probably will be elected, as democratically elected, in Bolivia as the next president. He's certainly considered to have the inside track. He came very, very close in the last election, which was a couple of years ago. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, of course, is a kind of separate situation because first of all, he has been elected not once, not twice, not thrice, but 4, 5, 6 times. And of course, the United States has tried to overthrow him. Chavez also has economic power. And he's now using that economic power to create an independent media. For the first time in Latin America, there is now something called Telesur, which is modeled after Al Jazeera, the Arabic satellite TV network, where people hear real news that's going on. You find out what's happening in the campo and in the barrios, not just in the palaces of the rich and the powerful. They're not looking for comments from government ministers, which are simply reductive, formulaic kinds of expressions of, platitudes and cliches. We're making progress. Of course we care about the people. All of these things are just interchangeable around the world. But, it's particularly acute in this situation. That's a very exciting development. Here in the United States, certainly since Cindy Sheehan has come to the fore in the last few months. The Iraq War has a face now. She has given it a certain character, the resistance at least, a certain character, and people have been able to mobilize around her and the Gold Star families for peace, other mothers who have lost their sons or daughters in this criminal war in Iraq. And that's very, very encouraging. Cindy Sheehan captured the imagination of the country when she went to Crawford, Texas in August. She's going again in the next few days during Thanksgiving week, again to simply ask a simple question of the commander-in-chief, the same guy who said, bring them on. You want to fight? Bring them on. Mr. Bring them on. The same guy. I want to know. I want an explanation. Why did my son die? And she's not acting alone. You may think, these are random actions, but these are people with organizations behind them. And I met some of the people in Mendocino County where I was just a couple of weeks ago. A lot of the Veterans for Peace, because Cindy Sheehan's from Vacaville, they, connected with her and supported her. And when Cindy Sheehan spoke at the Veterans for Peace convention in Dallas I think it was in early August, they formed a caravan, like a military unit to protect her and to get her established there in Crawford. And so that was part of that action. 50 years ago, December 1st, another courageous woman, happened to be an American, African-American, refused to sit in the back of the bus, Rosa Parks. She died. She was 92 years old. There was a state funeral for her, and there was a lot of the usual kind of summary of her life, instructive as to what was left out of Rosa Parks' life in most of the conventional media accounts. You see, most of the censorship occurs by omission. They're not actually committing lies. They are omitting the truth. So simple things don't get reported on. Just to give you an example, how many of you know, maybe in this audience it's a little different, that Donald Rumsfeld met Saddam Hussein at the height of his atrocities, at the height of his war crimes, at the behest of the American President Ronald Reagan in 1982 and 1983. And as a result of those meetings, took Iraq off the State Department list of terrorist states and started supplying Iraq with the ingredients to make weapons of mass destruction, like chlorine and potassium nitrate and other products, and gave billions and billions of dollars of loans, guaranteed loans, to Iraq. How many of you know, as a result of that meeting, that the United States military gave Saddam Hussein attack helicopters, the same helicopters that were used a few years later in the poison gas attacks on the Kurds of Halabja? That's left out. Everybody knows about what happened to the Kurds at Halabja. But no one knows how the gas was delivered. The gas itself was probably had U.S. components to it. The helicopters were U.S.-made Bell Huey helicopters. So that goes down the memory hole. With Rosa Parks, what's gone down the memory hole? The fact that she was an ideologically driven, radical woman, not simply the way she was presented as a seamstress who had a long day at work and had tired feet and didn't want to sit down in the back of the bus. First of all, you have to see the racist component of this. Further that, the stereotype of indolent people of color. I mean, that's classic. But denying her ideological roots. This was not an ordinary woman. I mean, we're all ordinary and we're all extraordinary, right? Like Cindy Sheehan. She's an ordinary woman. She puts her socks on the same way you do and, does everything the same way we do, basically. Rosa Parks went to the Highlander Center in Tennessee. How many of you know what the Highlander Center is? It's a radical school where you learn the theory of nonviolence, where you study the tactics and the discipline of civil disobedience, where you learn about Gandhi and what he did in India and other people who have practiced civil disobedience around the world. And then she came back to Montgomery. And this was not the first time they tried to launch a bus boycott. It was the third or fourth attempt. And this particular one, again, it was, had a catalyst to it. It had a certain radical element, and that was in the person of a 26-year-old preacher that had just moved to Montgomery from Atlanta, Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr. So he became the articulate, charismatic voice which pushed that movement forward. And 381 days later, that's how long that boycott lasted, the strike was broken. The bus company said, okay, we will integrate the buses. And this was an enormous victory. It was an enormous moral victory. And it was a victory that came at a time, again, when you listen to the naysayers, you listen to the negative people. Like if I would have listened to the people in 1978, they say, you're crazy. Who's going to buy your cassettes? Who wants to listen to this stuff? How are you going to make a living? Be realistic. Do something useful. All I heard, all negative things. Don't bother. It's too much headache. Go somewhere else. Do something else. In the same way, if you would have looked at the situation in the South in 1955, and not just in the South, but at the level of the federal government, there was total opposition to African Americans. Every American president since 1865 was violating the Constitution by not enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. Every single one of them should have been impeached on those grounds. But then, of course, you had the Congress and the Supreme Court also violating the Constitution. So who will bring criminals to justice when all three branches of the federal government are saturated with criminality? So at the federal level, no support for African Americans. At best, neutral. At the state level, you have active, resistance, oppression, repression of African Americans. You have, state houses controlled by fanatic fundamentalist segregationists like James Eastland and Bilbao and Strom Thurmond and Dick Russell and people like that. At the state house level, come down to the courthouse, the sheriffs, the deputies, the police, the judges, the court systems, the juries themselves were all white, pre-selected. Now, if you're an African American, you look out, this is over before it starts. Why bother? Game over. Let's just stay with the status quo. Well, again, I think, a few people mobilize, like Margaret Mead said. Change happens when a few people get together and start doing things. And then everybody kind of jumps on board, once the train leaves the station, and they say, well, that's going to a good place. Get me on, here I come, and that's how movements start. And I think it's very instructive that, what happened in Montgomery in 1955. All of the information I just gave you about Rosa Parks has basically gone down the memory hole. In fact, in one American textbook that I read, it goes something like this. Rosa Parks was tired. She refused to sit in the back of the bus. The bus driver told her, go to the back of the bus. That's where you belong. She did not. The bus driver called the police. The police arrested Rosa Parks. I mean, that's almost verbatim from an American history elementary textbook. You see, denying, and why has it been important to deny her? Well, because she's African American and she's ideologically driven. She's not an ordinary person in that sense. And so the image of an African American woman who's ideologically driven and militant is very, very threatening. Which is one of the reasons that Angela Davis, engendered so much loathing and hatred from the federal government. I mean, she was put on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover were incensed about Angela Davis, primarily because she was black and she was smart, and she was militant, and all of these things, conspired against her. Well, just a few years ago, alternative radio was only on a few radio stations in the country. Today it's on KPFK, and Fridays at 2, and hundreds of other stations, but also all over Canada, all over Australia, South Africa, and England. So it's growing. In 1996, Amy Goodman, who very few people had heard about, started a program in New York at WBAI called Democracy Now! It was a temporary election year program. There was no intention for it to continue beyond the November presidential election. 9 years later, that program is being heard every day, an hour a day, on almost 400 radio stations. That's a remarkable achievement. And again, I wasn't privy to, the conversations and the meetings back in 1996, but I can say with almost certainty that people were saying, who's going to listen? I mean, who's going to pay for this stuff? I mean, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing something else, maybe news or music. Who's Amy Goodman? People don't know who she is. This is a non-starter. Always the negativity. And today, it's a huge success. Rightfully so. It's far and away the best single program in all of public broadcasting. There's nothing like it on NPR, National Propaganda Radio, and there's nothing like it on PBS, the Petroleum Broadcasting Service. So stay with Amy Goodman, stay with Democracy Now! A few years ago, there was no fairness and accuracy in reporting in New York. The Media Watchdog Group, which produces Counterspin and also has a newsletter and produces very valuable information about the media. There wasn't a Deep Dish TV in Boulder, Colorado. There wasn't Deep Dish TV in New York. Free Speech TV in Boulder, Colorado. There wasn't independent documentary films being made. Or if they were made, like the Battle of Algiers in 1966, they were completely forgotten. They were never distributed. They were never shown. It took literally years before American and non-American filmmakers started, discovering cameras and this whole documentary film art form. I mentioned The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Maybe I didn't. It's about Hugo Chavez and the coup in Venezuela in April 2002, made by two young Irish filmmakers. There's the fantastic film on Al Jazeera called Control Room by Jahan Nujam. Very instructive for those of you who have not seen it. The American officer, a captain, his name is Josh Rushing, he's interfacing with his Al Jazeera counterparts. They would say, Americans are committing war crimes in Iraq, and he says, no, I don't think so. The reports we have indicate that it's, that's not true. And they would keep, bringing up issues, and you could start to see just little slivers of light, opening in this Marine captain's brain. Just a little bit of doubt, like he'd say, well, maybe I'll look into that. He wasn't like categorically dismissing it, that's rubbish, or that's a pack of lies. I'll look into that. We'll see what's there. And he was ostracized when the film came out. He became a target of vitriol and vituperation by the military, by his colleagues in the military. And he was a career military guy. He finally quit the military, and he's going to be a correspondent for Al Jazeera in English. Al Jazeera is opening an English language service in 2005. I'm certainly looking forward to it. I've watched Al Jazeera in Arabic. I mean, I don't understand a lot of what's going on, a little bit. It's very, very good journalism. Those cameras go where no one else goes. And for very simple reasons. They know the language. They know the culture. They know, the geography. And so they can get to places. Unlike our embedded journalists who are in bed with their units, literally sleeping with the enemy. Instead of having, a distance, which is what journalists should be doing, right? They should be if there's a parade, the journalists should be on the sidelines, observing the parade, reporting on it. Instead, these overpaid gas bags who compete for the best hair on the air, they're marching in the parade. Where is their independence? They're waving flags. They're saying, God bless America. Our troops, it's interesting how they use the collective pronoun. Our troops, we are invading Iraq. Who are we? Where is that distance? It's completely collapsed. And you hear it in the grammar. You hear it in the use of pronouns. It's very, very revealing. And one of the things I learned from Chomsky and Marshall McLuhan is pay attention to language. See how language is used. It's very revealing about, our war in Iraq or the war on terrorism. Every time Bush says the word peace, you have to think just the opposite, war. Hitler used the word peace a lot. Hannah Arendt, the great sociologist, who wrote The Banality of Evil, Eichmann in Jerusalem, She also wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism. And one of the chapters in there, it makes for very chilling reading if you want to get some echoes of the past and feel it today in reverberation. Not identical. It's a different historical situation. I'm not saying this is Nazi Germany. I'm not saying we live in a fascist state. But there are some elements and some tendencies which are being duplicated, with an American, shape and form. One of the things she pointed out, one of the things she researched, was Hitler's Reichstag speeches in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And she would call them his peace speeches. It was all about his great devotion to peace and how Germany wanted peace and the German people were peaceful. All their desire was to live amicably with their neighbors. But they were surrounded by hostile enemies. And if attacked, of course the German people would, even though we were peace-loving and loved peace, we would have to defend ourselves. And you see also with Bush using the word peace in the same way. And Hannah Arendt said, whenever a country, for example, if Hitler was talking about Czechoslovakia, we admire the Czech people, their literature and culture and music and learning. They are one of the preeminent peoples of Mitteleuropa, Central Europe, etc. Then you knew the next day the German army was going to attack. When they started praising, Greece, it's great learning and literature and, Euripides and Homer and all of that. That's it. All game over. Next day, the German army attacks because Germany had to defend itself. Germany had to defend itself against Poland in 1939 in a speech. She said, "We are surrounded. The Polish army is provoking an attack, and we have to respond to it." I mean, the Polish army, it's almost an oxymoron, compared to the fighting capacity of the Germans. It was like, it's like water pistols versus tanks, or slingshots versus bazookas. I mean, you can't even talk about it in those terms. And so today, whenever the American president says, of course we want peace, what American president is going to tell you, we are a warmongering imperialist country that is working on the behalf of ExxonMobil, Halliburton, Bechtel, Chevron Texaco, and ConocoPhillips. Sign up and fight in my war. Pay taxes and fight in my war. You're all laughing, right? Of course. And it's transparent. So there's a tissue of lies. Lies after lies after lies about freedom, about democracy, about liberation, about I'm protecting you. It's like Big Brother. You're in danger. I'm the only one that can protect you. Come to me, my children. Come under my umbrella. I will keep you safe from all of those evildoers out there. Evildoers that this administration and past U.S. administrations have created, particularly in Afghanistan. Again, the hidden history of the past 20 years. If people don't know history, then, as I said, they can pull anything out of the hat. They can tell you the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. Oh, I thought it rises in the east and sets in... No, don't you know? Hey, man, the science. I have here a book. I'm sure like Joseph McCarthy. I have here in my hand a list of 257 communists in the State Department. Go see the Edward R. Murrow film, Good Night and Good Luck, that George Clooney, to his credit, directed and acted in. It's very important to see this film to see how hysteria works and the uses of fear. McCarthy in the 1950s, you may not know, some of you may not know who he is. He was a junior senator from Wisconsin. He saw communists everywhere. Under your chair, in your bathtub, in your closet, under your bed, under your pillow, in your office, in your works. Everyone, the communists were everywhere. They were taking over. It was like the invasion of the body snatchers. Everyone was getting snatched up. The communists were in pumpkins, they were in watermelons, they were in Fresno in the Central Valley and all the cantaloupes and other melons that the Armenians grow there. And here was Murrow in 1954, a journalist with some courage. I mean, there aren't many left today, who said, we're going to present McCarthy in his own words. That's what's so effective about the film, and actually the original broadcast, which I remember seeing, even though I was a kid in 1954, I kind of grew up and worshipped Edward R. Murrow as kind of my model. You know, he seems like so dignified and, so erudite and urbane, and he seemed like he knew so many things. And so I was very impressed with him. And in the film, you'll see that Murrow only uses McCarthy's words. He doesn't interpret them. He doesn't say, this is what he means. There are no explications or, explanations. Give them enough rope and they will hang themselves, as one famous comrade once said. And if any network did that today with Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush, a half hour of their lies, from Iraq is an imminent threat to the security of the United States, that there is no doubt that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and will use them. There's no doubt that it has Scud missiles and underground factories and weapons and drones of death that were going to cover the United States and poison all of our crops with anthrax and ricin and other chemical weapons and bacteriological agents. If you just go through those, go through Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations on February 5th, 2003, when, he said he made 29 allegations about Iraq. Iraq had this, Iraq had that. Mohammed Atta met with Iraqi secret intelligence in Prague, in the Czech Republic, where they were given instructions because Iraq was connected to Al-Qaeda. It was giving Al-Qaeda all its information, how to attack the United States and all these things. 29. It was a dog and pony show, if you remember. There were tapes. There were some photographs. He'd show, here's a black and white photograph of a truck in front of a factory, and the other photograph showed the factory and the truck was gone. And he said, this is because UN weapons inspectors were coming, and so the truck, which had weapons of mass destruction, drove away, into the desert night. There was a slight problem with this story, slight problem of chronology. As Hans Blix pointed out just 10 days later in the UN, these photographs were taken 2 weeks apart. And on, intercepts in Arabic of Iraqis talking to one another, purporting to show, that, they're coming, we got to hide the goods and things like that. All of it, I would love to see the original Arabic. I think it's laughable, the translations. 29 allegations made. Not one proved to be correct. Now, that is rather extraordinary. There is such a thing as statistical error. If you blindfold me and there's a dartboard there and I'm throwing darts, at least one or two, if I know where the board is, one or two is going to land on that board. 29 out of 29 is batting 1,000% in error. And what did the corporate media do that day, that moments after that speech? Every single one of them went on and said, the case has been made, the case is over. Iraq is guilty as charged. We must defend, the media is speaking, we must defend ourselves. We must protect our country against them. I remember one report called it a magisterial performance. It's interesting how they use theatrical language. He showed great resolve and he was in command of all the facts. He was eloquent and articulate. It sounds like Laurence Olivier in Hamlet, the way they're talking about, he was articulate and eloquent. It's one of the most appalling examples of propaganda and lying, I think, in history. All we would ask is that the networks run that Powell speech or the Rumsfeld speeches or the Cheney speeches or the Bush speeches and then run a scroll underneath, lie. And here's the information. So you would have simultaneous translation in a language we understand, English. Not Orwell speak, not news speak, not doublethink. So you would see, Iraq has anthrax, and then you would see no anthrax found. In fact, there was an act of terrorism in October 2001 involving anthrax, in which U.S. agents have been implicated. That the anthrax spores came from some National Institutes of Health labs here in the United States. As soon as that information came out, it was buried. There was such hysteria about anthrax. This is, a few weeks after 9/11. And they were looking, this is the next wave. It's going to be bacteriological warfare. How come we haven't had any justice for the 5 Americans who were killed by anthrax? Because I think it would lead to very embarrassing information. It obviously came from a government source. It certainly came from a government lab. But gone. Is that investigation even proceeding at this point? It's now 4 years. I kind of doubt it. Because they count on us, as Gore Vidal says, to be the USA, the United States of amnesia, to remember nothing. We have a kind of national Alzheimer's disease here, where all of our brain cells have kind of been hollowed out and tossed into a dumpster. And so there's no memory. And again, without memory, like without a vision, a people will perish. I think without memory, a people do perish. It's true. If we don't know our history, if we don't know, what has happened, then we are totally vulnerable and susceptible to being manipulated and to be controlled. And in this era of mass media and of propaganda, they have all the instruments to do that. It's a situation which, Goebbels would have turned green with envy if he were alive today. And it was, to speak of Goebbels, then he was considered a wunderkind, a master of propaganda in Hitler's regime. He said the purpose of propaganda is to present an ostensible diversity behind which lies an actual uniformity. Present an ostensible diversity behind which lies an actual uniformity. So it's very much like that Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing on. Now, of course, the boss would have to add a 0. It'd be 570 channels and nothing on. You go into a magazine store, hundreds and hundreds of magazines. Wow, what diversity, what opportunity we have. Like everything else, multiplicity of impacts and possibilities. But once you strip the veneer off that stuff, like the media, it's quite uniform. It's almost a monochromatic one-note samba, the kind of drumbeat that is produced. Saddam, Osama, 9/11, weapons of mass destruction, the World Trade Center, Osama, bin Laden, Hussein, Saddam, bin Laden, Osama, Hussein, Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. It's like what Hitler says. With constant repetition, we can convince people that heaven is hell and hell is heaven. We can convince people, this is Goebbels, that a square is a circle and a circle is a square. These are just words. And we can mold words. We can mold people's minds by propaganda. And there's a quote here. And here's the kind of the role of the Scheisse.
I'm going to air that.
That's Armenian. You can air that. You see, because I do radio, I learned very early always to curse in a foreign language, like futra and merd and, curse in other languages. Because if you curse in English in those words, you can lose your license. So you curse, I always curse in a foreign language. This is what Orwell wrote. Circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip. We've all seen that. But the really well-trained dog is the one that turns his somersault when there is no whip. And that is our media today. Those are our journalists today, conduits of lies like Judith Miller, Bob Woodward, and many, many others, Robert Novak. You can't even call them journalists. It defies description. We'd have to invent a new category. Maybe stenographers would be better for them rather than journalists. And they're so willing to do it. They're so willing to be servile and obsequious and subordinate to state power. They're so craven to have that invitation to the White House to have, tea with Laura Bush or, visit with the vice president or play tennis with the Secretary of Defense. They have been sucked into a system, kind of like a whirlpool of socialization where they have lost their journalistic integrity. And so we have to think about, reinventing the media. Fortunately, that's happening. And young people today are deserting the corporate media in droves. And they know it, and they're worried about it. Newspaper circulation is way down. traditional kinds of media, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News, World Report, way down. Young people in particular are going to radical information sites, some of which I mentioned on the internet, also reading books published by Haymarket, published by Beacon, published by Southend Press in Cambridge, published by Common Courage Press in Monroe, Maine, Seven Stories Press in New York, some of the publishers that I work with here. They are watching documentaries like Control Room and Walmart and Uncovered and Unprecedented and The Revolution Will Not Be Televised and Peace Propaganda in the Promised Land and 9/11 Hijacking Catastrophe and The Corporation, probably the best single film on capitalism. You don't have to study economics at Brown or some Ivy League school. You can just watch that film, The Corporation, and understand how corporations organize themselves, how they have been invested with personhood, which allows them to have First Amendment rights, which allows them to saturate the political system with money, because money becomes equivalent to free speech, and they are people. I mean, how that works, I don't quite understand how corporations can have the rights of individuals, but that's what the Supreme Court ruled in, I think, 1886. So this is a very valuable tool of information. And there are all kinds of other great things happening, in terms of independent media in the United States. The success of community radio is quite impressive. That's where I come from, KGNU in Boulder. Very recently, in the last year, KGNU bought a frequency in Denver and has now expanded into Denver. So the largest city in the Rocky Mountain West now hears alternative radio, now hears Democracy Now!, now hears Making Contact, Counterspin, Women's International News Gathering Service, This Way Out, the gay and lesbian news service, and all the other radical and progressive programs that are carried on KGNU. And again, I can tell you, I was privy to some of those conversations in Boulder when everyone said, no, don't buy the frequency. It's too expensive. Who's going to listen? Who's going to pay for the microphones? Who's going to be at the studio when the phone rings? Who's going to answer the phone? All these negative things, people with, what Trungpa Rinpoche, a great Tibetan Lama, said, who had lived in Boulder, he said, it's all setting sun energy. We want rising sun energy. We want to think positive, that another world is possible. So I believe it is. There are many, many millions of us around the world who are dedicated to making another world possible. And you have your role to play in that, not just as passive observers, but as active citizens that are engaged in whatever way, again, as I mentioned earlier, that you feel authentic in doing. Whether it's, writing a check, there's no shame in giving money to grassroots organizations like Global Exchange, for example, or any of the other solidarity groups that are operating in the country for women's rights, for African American rights, for Latino rights. There's no shame in that. If you can work, in some community organizations. This is not, Wawa, North Dakota. This is Long Beach. This is a major American city. You're not far from Los Angeles. You're not living in an isolated cocoon somewhere. There must be groups and organizations right here in this town that you can connect with, join, lend your support to, maybe have a garage sale or some kind of bake sale and do what you can to support groups here in the community. Because ultimately, all politics is local. And it does start, think globally, but it's hard for us to act globally. We can act locally. And that's what you can do. So I'll see you out there making noise. Thank you very much.